Sri Sugalsan Jain, who is in the background of all this magnificent event which we are experiencing, and Sri Prasant Chand Jain, who welcomed all of us, and my good friend and one of the most important pillars of this institution, which is devising and improving the methods of assessing and awarding people in the most objective manner, Sri T.S. Krishnamurthy, Sri Praveenbhai Chadha, and Mr. Another Krishnamurthy, who always connects me to this organization. In spite of the fact that I have a very anarchic schedule, still he is able to catch me and bring me to the meetings. Mr. Sugalsan Jain, who's the backbone of this, is not on the stage. But it is entirely in tune with the traditions of this country that generosity and humility always go together. If somebody is generous, the generosity should be matched by humility. And that is what we see here. And that's one of the reasons why, even though the request was communicated by my good friend Mr. T.N. Sitaraman, who is sitting here, asking me to be on the panel of the juries, I have never been on any panel so far to select people. This is the only institution of which I am a member to select someone for any position. So it is not because that I have agreed it is a great institution. I have agreed because it is a great institution. So that's how I would like to put it. See, philanthropy in India is not independent of the culture, tradition, value systems and our spirituality. Philanthropy is the manifestation of all this. Quite unfortunately, sometime in the year 2009, a very important political leader of this country spoke at a function organized to celebrate the award that was given to Bill Gates, Indira Gandhi Award for International Understanding. And that political leader spoke because that leader had no much understanding of India. And so the person spoke that philanthropic traditions is lacking among the rich people in India. It was an ignorant speech of a person who is not well versed about India, but that speech was lifted by the Wall Street Journal and a front page article was written, Indian riches, please open your wallets. This was the front page article in Wall Street Journal, which destroyed the reputation of all rich people in India because of the ignorant speech of an illiterate person who heads a political party in this country. I don't want to mention the name and lose my dignity in the bargain. What is the truth of all this? There is a report by Hudson Institute. Much before this political leader spoke about the philanthropic habits of different countries in the world. And Hudson Institute is an American institute. And it said that the Indian and Asian riches, they give about 12% of their income and wealth for charity. And only 8% of the North American riches do. This is the study of Hudson Institute. And I was surprised to find that no one in the Indian media challenged that leader's illiterate statement with this kind of authentic study by Hudson Institute, one of the most famous institutions, studying the behavior of the rich people all over the world. And they brought out this report. But the entire Indian media is so illiterate that it could not even unearth this basic information available on the net and put it out to question that leader, how did you talk so poorly about the Indian riches? You know, in India, I have been from a village, and I know how the word charity is a recent innovation, intervention, interpolation in our dictionary. It is the idea of dharma. It is sharing, not giving. Shraddhaya Deyam, the man who gives must thank the receiver because there is someone to receive. And the giver should be humble to make the receiver feel great. It should not be the other way. The giver should not be great to make the receiver feel humble. This is the Indian tradition. And in this tradition, it is not only the rich people who give. There is one study by the Participatory Research Institution of Asia. It is called PRIA. This study was mandated by the Planning Commission in the year 2002 about the philanthropic habits of the ordinary people in India. And it was one of the most massive samples undertaken by the Planning Commission. 100,000 families in different parts of India were surveyed as to their philanthropic habits. And the findings were astounding. This was a study done in 2001 when Indian economy was not doing that well, and it was not considered as an economy at all. We were considered to be a rotten nation, poor nation, illiterate nation. The picture has changed now. But at that time, that was the image of India. And the study said that rural households, 2/3 of the rural households, share some part of their earnings for the people who they feel are needy. And 1/4 of the givers are educated less than third standard. Illiterates, who we call as illiterate. By the modern standards, my mother was illiterate, but she kept us without a doctor till 1991, when I had come from England with urinary tract infection, and our family did not have a doctor because she kept us without a doctor. And I had to telephone to Manoj Santalia, who is the chairman of the Indian Express, say, I have 104 degrees temperature, please suggest a doctor for me. She is illiterate in India. If you don't know English, you was illiterate. Those people, 25% of the people who give are illiterate people in India, and people with less than 8,000 rupees income per annum, 40% of the people who give belong to this category. This is the study of the PRIA Institute. So giving is actually sharing. You know, your constituency is not only the giver and taker constituency. You have to give to everyone in this country. No one's income in this country belongs to oneself. Anyone can make a demand on you. Your classmate will come, your villager will come, your distant relative will come. You cannot say no to anyone. Philanthropy is in the blood of India. And there is also another thing in the blood of India, not to talk about the philanthropy one does. People feel shy to talk about what they give. But if you look at many of these institutions abroad, top institutions, whether it is, I don't want to name them, but they are top institutions which are supposed to be highly philanthropic and hog the limelight wherever they go because they are from abroad. 60 to 70% of their total receipts is for administrative expenses. In fact, many institutions which are working in India, NGOs, you can find a huge amount of money is spent on the staff, on the CEOs. a multinational philanthropy institution in India, in publicity. A multinational philanthropy institution in India appointed a CEO whose remuneration they refused to reveal, but it got leaked out. It was $3 million a year. This is a charitable institution, philanthropic institution, commanding global goodwill, name, power, influence. They can go and meet the Prime Minister when they want because they ask for an appointment. Nobody can say no. It is power, it is not philanthropy. But we are seeing something very different here. I participate in meetings. But here, the ecosystem in which I participate makes me feel noble, makes me feel good. I am in the company of a very select set of people. So, these are people who, without any claim, including name, they have been working. For example, the selection method. Shamshad Begum, we analyzed and we got the reports and all that, but still the juries felt, you must once again go and do a proper inspection whether everything that we have been told is right or not. And a verification was made, and whatever was stated was found to be true, and then only this award was finally given. You must understand the strictest standards on which this award is being given, and how these great people who are working for the society without any claim, without any name, without any ad. I know Dr. Ramani, I went to his establishment. I was amazed that people do charity, but the scale at which he is doing, millions of people being the beneficiaries, operating in 11 states. I was just surprised unless there was some motivation which is of a very high order and divine blessings which is equally of a high order. This kind of scaling up is not possible. It's a massive amount of work. So each award here has been given and the institution must feel proud. Sugal Chand Jain must feel proud. Mahavir Foundation must feel proud for honoring these people. So I am extremely happy that I have participated in a function where such great people are being honored by people who are equally great, and there is a meeting of both generosity and humility. As I was coming, Mr. Sugal Chand Jain told me, why don't you talk about economics? You see, economics we understand through newspapers, through GDP, per capita income, expenditure. This is not economics. Economics in India has a very different meaning. And if you look at the Western countries, I will not take much time and it will not be an exposition for experts. I will talk in the way in which anyone can understand economics. It doesn't require much education. Economists have made economics a preserve of economics, which is wrong. All of us need to understand what is economics. I'll just take one differential. This is on the basis of which my entire theory of economics is built, and an alternative viewpoint which we began articulating in the last 25 years have found some merit today because nobody is in a position to reject what we are saying, because it is purely based on an out-of-box observation of different cultures and civilizations and what we are. I'll give you a small example. In America, 55% of the first marriages end in divorce within 10 years. And if somebody had some lurking desire to marry, 67% of the second marriages end in divorce. But if somebody had some more compelling desire to marry, 74% of the third marriages end in divorce. 41% of the babies born are born for unwed mothers. Half of them are school-going children. There are crushes attached to schools. There is a complete collapse of the family system. And in 1998, an American sociologist wrote a book. Because in a family, there is no father and mother living together, or there is no father at all. And so he wrote a book, We Are Now Emerging as a Fatherless America. You know the result of all this. There is no one to take care of the parents, there is no one, certainly not the grandparents, there is no one to take care of the sons, daughters. With the result, the obligations which a family discharges, a parent discharges, a son discharges, a daughter discharges, these obligations have been nationalized. The family has been nationalized because these responsibilities have been taken over by the government. The government takes care of the elders, infirm people, unemployed people, unhealthy people. And you know what is the cost of this? There is a future responsibility which you are taking. Somebody who is in the age of 30, the government assures that I will take care of your life. That means the government has undertaken the responsibility to maintain him because their longevity is also expanding because of the medical science which is doing the miracle of extending people's lives. So, if you reduce the future responsibilities in monetary values to present day terms, the Harvard economist, in which one was an Indian economist, has estimated that the present value of the future social security payments is $104 trillion, whereas America's GDP is only $18 trillion. So if anything is sticking under the economy of America to blast it to pieces, it is this social security. So there used to be discussions in economic discourse about privatization, which is the most privatized economy in the world. So in the course of a discussion, one Kumar Bhattacharya, who is a Warwick University professor, he has advised TVS also. TVS executive is not here, he has just now left. So Kumar Bhattacharya has been a friend of mine, so we used to discuss in the course of the corporate advisory, we had come close. Kumar told me, Guru, why are you opposing the privatization of Indian Airlines? Why are you opposing the privatization of BHEL? So I asked him, why are you saying these should be privatized? Because they are a burden on the government. Yes, why should the government run airways? Why should it run railways? Why should it run bus services? Why should it run some producing some turbines? These can all be done by private parties. The government should take care of the border, the government should take care of the things which are more difficult for private parties to do. I told him this, what you say is right. But I want to ask you a question, which is the biggest public burden of the government in the West? It is social security, health security. I said, you can sell Air India and get money. If you privatize Air India, you will get money. But can you ever privatize social security? Because if you have to privatize social security, you need families. You cannot create families by law. You cannot create families by order of the government. It's a natural, cultural, spiritual, social evolution. They have destroyed the entire family base. Savings has come down. America, which was the supplier of capital to the world 40 years back, is the biggest borrower in the world. Asia produces 75% of world's savings, and America borrows 79% of world's savings. In fact, Venkatramanan, who was the Reserve Bank governor, he once wrote an article in Business Line. If you go and borrow 1 crore from the bank manager has left just now. The bank manager will harass the borrower. Come on, give me this statement, that statement, you must. The borrower will be terrified. But if you borrow 2,000 crores from the bank chairman will go to the borrower. Are you okay? You need anything more? Because if the borrower fails, the bank will collapse. So Venkatramanan said, that is the economy of America. It has borrowed from all over the world. So if anything happens to America, the world will collapse. For example, take China. China minted so much of money by exporting. They have an export surplus of about $3.5 trillion. out of which some $2.5 trillion they have invested in America. And they are only praying every day the American economy should be all right. Otherwise, if anything happens to American economy, China will go bust. So somebody said there is only one way you can repair the American economy and Chinese economy, merge both the countries. That is the only way economics can work. You know, many people do not know the ratio of dependence of the Indian society on the Indian government is not even 1/10 of the ratio of dependence of the American people on the American government. It is because of this mutual sharing, mutual helping. I'll give you one example. In the year 1994, one of my friends had an appointment with the bankers and he had a 100 crore settlement. 1994, 100 crore settlement meant it must be 2000 crores today. And so when he was about to go, in those days you could go and leave the car in the airport, come back in the evening, pick up the car and come back home. So he was driving his car himself. And his neighbor's wife came and shouted, "My husband has chest pain, please, she has to be taken to the hospital." And this man forgot all his appointment, settlement. His company is in trouble. He straight went into the house of the neighbor, put the man in the car and took him to the hospital. The person escaped, but his bank appointment went up in smoke. For 4 years he could not get a settlement, and he got a settlement at maybe 500 crores or 600 crores cost. So I always used to ask him, if you had not done that, how would you have felt? He said, if I had done that, not taken him to the hospital, and if something had happened to him, I would never have lived in peace in my whole life. That is relationship. You have relationship with parents, with friends, with neighbors, with relatives, with employers and employees. You can never do hire and firing in India. It's impossible. So there is a psychology working in this country. It's not these 125 crore people have no problems. Everybody has problems. Which country doesn't have problems? Your problems can be remedied. America's problems cannot be remedied. You can never make the husband and wife live together by giving tax concessions. So economics in India, the way it is being taught, has nothing to do with Indian economics. Family is the foundation of Indian economics. But the word family is not found in the textbooks of economics. You know why? Our textbooks are carbon copied from the Western economic thinkers, and there is no family in the West, and so there is no family in India also. I will conclude my speech with an experience of mine. You know, this was in 1990s. I began to, of course I was always interested in economics as a subject, but I could not afford to read economics because that would not give me the kind of income that I need for sustaining a very large joint family. So I became a chartered accountant. But economics was my life interest. So I used to study cross-cultural economic studies, sociological economic studies. So in 1990s, when the liberalization, globalization tsunami came and swept the entire world, including India, I was advisor to many corporates. Many top corporates have been I was advising them or I was their friend. At that time, they had lost all their confidence. In fact, at that time, the Secretary Economic Affairs used to advise these Indian industrialists, it is better you sell away, you become traders, because if you are running steel industry with 2 million tons of steel capacity, it is nothing. The world is operating at 20 million, 30 million, 40 million tons of steel. How can you ramp up your capacity to that extent? If you are producing 10,000 cars, you need to produce 1 million cars to survive. You cannot sell it. You don't have the capital, you don't have the resources, you don't have the technology. Only one man thought differently. I have great respect for him. When he was told you must sell your automobile industry, he said, no, I will produce a car for India. And that was Ratan Tata. That was against all the advice that international consultants gave him. And he could ramp up the steel production to 25, 30 million tons. Lakshmi Mittal went to 40 million tons. Indians could do it. But Indian government, Indian economists, Indian media, Indian intellectuals did not have faith in Indian businessmen. Because there is no Indian thinking in India. The English educated Indian is only half Indian. This is my experience of English educated people. So when I took a travel across the country at that time, I went to Ludhiana, Batala, Rajkot, Jamnagar, Morbi, right down to Thoothukudi. I must have gone about 40-45 industrial clusters where I spent at least 4 to 5 days to understand how people there work. I was amazed to find in Ludhiana and Batala, and what I found was something which no economist in India has done any study of. I have put this question in many IITs and IIMs. Which is the place with the highest per capita income in India? They used to be flabbergasted. I said, which is not the place? It's not Delhi, it's not Bombay, it's not Calcutta, it's not Chennai, it's not Bangalore, it's not Hyderabad. Tell me which place. No idea. It is Morbi in Gujarat. You know, it is a place with 2.5 lakh population and 1.4 lakh people are employed. 1,000 textile units, 1,000 diamond cutting units. You have Ajanta wall clock here, they manufacture the Ajanta wall clock and sell it all over the world. They established the clock-making unit in China to take advantage of the most favored nation treatment with America to export to America, which they could not have done from India, and none of them knew English. So when I traveled across the country, my understanding about Indian entrepreneurship, the hard work they do, I went to Tirupur. In Tirupur, you know, they post about $4 billion exports today of knitwear garments. And 70% of the employers are educated less than 10th standard. Only 7% are graduates. This is the study which Boston Consulting made, and the title of the book is Fraternal Capital, and one Dr. Chari from India. He was seconded by the Boston Consulting to make a study of Tirupur, because they found from Tirupur so much of exports is coming, but in Indian map there is no Tirupur. Then they came to Tamil Nadu, there was a Tirupur. Then they wanted to study Tirupur. Then they asked the PSG Institute of Financial Management. PSG Institute was so happy they have got a call from Boston Consulting to study Tirupur. So these people arranged the car, they arranged the logistics, stay, everything. But the study was done by Boston Consulting. PSG Institute of Financial Management did not think of studying Tirupur. This study came in the 2002 World Development Report, how Tirupur, by using and leveraging on its social capital, was able to produce and has become the knitwear center of Asia. In fact, one finance minister asked me, आप Tirupur के बारे में बार-बार बोल रहे हो, क्या हो रहा है उधर? He did not even know that Tirupur is posting this kind of turnover. I found Indian family is the basis of India, and our family savings to GDP ratio was 19% in the year 1992. And the rest of the savings was about 4%. 23% was the savings of India to GDP. So the government was saying, no, we need an investable capital of 32% because there is something called capital output ratio. If you invest 4 rupees, your GDP will grow by 1 rupee. So you are investing only 24%, so you are getting only 6% GDP. If you invest 32%, you will get 8% GDP. The difference has to be filled only by foreign investment. And so India needs foreign investment to ramp its growth to 10%. This was the argument against which we had to reply. At that time, there was Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati who came to India. And Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati was called the god of free trade in America. There were 2 gods in America. One was Alan Greenspan, who was called the god of money. And Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati, an Indian, who made great mark as a person who had done enormous study on global trade, and he was called the god of free trade. And he was the person who devised the WTO, World Trade Organization. He was the backbone of the World Trade Organization. So he had come to India, and Dr. Manmohan Singh said, "We are in a mess. Please tell us what we should do." He said it is very simple. The problem with India is that the Indian families save 19% of the GDP or their income. It should be brought down to 9 or 10%. The balance should be turned into expenditure. Yeah. Once you begin spending, that will become purchases, then that becomes supplies, then that becomes production, then becomes employment. Once the Indian family savings is cut by one half, after 2 years you will find India will be an economic superpower. But he said, I warn you, it will not happen easily. Because the Indian women are so stingy, they won't spend. They are always bothered about their children, their parents, their husband, their in-laws, unless you make them irresponsible. I am using the word irresponsible. Make them spend money, and they are not going to spend money on your worthless goods. Bring goods from abroad, go to big malls, cut down the tariff. You must entice them to spend. And once you succeed in making the Indian women consumers instead of being family women, afterwards nobody can stop the growth of India. I said, this man wants to Americanize India. It's not possible. You can probably try to Indianize America. The reverse is not going to work in this country. I said, India will improve. India will become great only through Indian savings. This was my exposition. I used to travel throughout the country, meet all top educationists, because my view was heard. So somebody went to Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati and said, Mr. Gurumurthy is saying this. What is your view? Gurumurthy? Is he economist? If Gurumurthy is economist, you can call me a Bharatanatyam dancer. This was, you can Google today, Gurumurthy, Bhagwati, Bharatanatyam dancer, you will get this news item. But you know what happened? You take the statistics from 1991 to 2014. The Indian family savings went up from 19% of the GDP to 27% of the GDP. National savings went up from 23% to 38%. And that is what yielded 10% growth rate. And in fact, Shankaracharya, who was the advisor to the government of India, wrote an article that India is the only country which has grown without any sizable foreign direct investment. You know the reason for what? It is actually the women of India who should be credited. In every town and city, I want a statue of the Indian housewife who has managed the finances without borrowing, somehow managing. They are the best managers of money. Though the husband may get irritated because of their tight control over the family finances, this is what has saved India. You know, in America, 23 crore Americans who deal with money have 120 crore credit cards on which they owe a debt of $3.5 trillion. $10 trillion is the housing debt. The entire American family is seeped in debt, drowning in debt. If you withdraw the credit card, the American economy will collapse. In India, you have credit card, people don't spend. It is only on the debit cards we spend. Debit card is your bank account. Have you ever heard any of these things being written or spoken by economists in this country? By policy makers? This economics, you can understand what I am saying. You know. This is economics. I am extremely happy that this is not what I wanted to talk, but Sugal Chandi told me that because you are known to be talking about economics, here also you talk about economics. Indian economics works because of a huge enhancing circular philanthropy that goes on in our society, in our community, in our families, in our religions. Unless we understand this, we cannot understand even why Sugal Chandi is promoting all this and sitting in the audience. This is our method. Thank you very much for
Thank you, sir. I request Sri Krishnamurthy to release the 19th awards brochure. The first copy will be received by our chief guest, Sri Guru.